Good afternoon. And we're starting a little bit delayed today, but interestingly because of a computer problem. But nonetheless, we are very pleased to welcome our speaker here today. Lewis Shepard has an incredible resume of experience. He has taught, he has been an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. He has worked in government at the Defense Intelligence Agency, building tools for information collection and connection after the 9/11 incident. Took all of that great expertise and moved to Microsoft, where he's currently director of the Institute for Advanced Technology for Government. He is a fairly prolific blogger, or at least tweeter, and has microblogging. There we go. 140 characters. But does a number of interesting things for Microsoft in the policy and government space. And he's going to tell us about some of those issues today as they relate to security. So please join me in welcoming Lewis Shepard.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Most of that was true. So I am with Microsoft, and I am here representing. It's kind of tough these days to dissociate yourself for professional purposes and say, I'm not representing the company, I'm only speaking for myself. But I'm going to make a couple of points that are really editorializing about some security issues in the field of research, so I am speaking for myself by and large. And really happy to be here, particularly because of the great lineage of this program and the kind of people, speakers that you've had in this program before. So if you have questions at any point, feel free. I don't have all that many slides, and I'd love to have questions either about the points that I make or the topic of information assurance and security and technology in general. It was mentioned that I had a government background. I was the head of requirements and research for defense intelligence. And this was a great time to be doing that because we were fighting several wars. But I joined Microsoft at the end of 2007 because I wanted to actually pick a company, Microsoft, which was ambitious. I wanted to pick a company that could replicate the kind of environment that I had, globally active, with a great research mindset. And looking around, there are really only a couple of places that you can do that, really particularly with a robust R&D environment. So you got your IBM, you got now a little bit more than 2007, Google, and maybe a couple of other people, but certainly Microsoft. I like to say this West Coast startup. If you think about the last decade, there was an article somewhere calling this Microsoft's lost decade. Fiscally, it was a tremendous decade. We made a ton of money, particularly the second half of that decade. Where did we invest a lot of that? R&D. So since I joined, we have increased our R&D annual budget from $6 billion, 2007, to a little over $9.5 billion, so a 60% increase. And you'll note this is over the years of the Great Recession. This is actually a wonderful time to be investing in R&D. Talent is better than ever and hungry to work. Some targeted acquisitions, some things like that. This is a great time to be investing in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we spend that amount of money. It's probably a 20-80 or maybe even 30-70 split between research and the larger amount being on development, advanced development. We have technology labs in all of our major product groups. So Microsoft Office has Office labs. The Windows team has its own R&D group, but all of it comes under the rubric and direction of Microsoft Research. So it's actually a great place to be. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas where we do spend that. We have It's somewhere north of 900 PhDs, so it's a very large research establishment. And I note the interns there because, I don't know, has anybody here done any work with Microsoft Research in your undergrad or graduate career? I wouldn't be shy about pursuing it because we actually wind up funding either in supporting on-campus work or in internships about 25% of the PhD students in US-based institutions in computer science or EE. So it's a pretty large footprint that we have in supporting graduate students. So I encourage you to go to the research.microsoft.com website and check out the internships. It's great work. We have labs around the world, and Redmond is our largest, and it's just a wonderful playground of activity. These are some of the areas. We really invest widely. There are several things on there that would probably surprise people to learn that Microsoft is actively pursuing research in some of these areas. There is a common spine to every one of them, no matter how outlandish it might seem, and that's information. So if there's information in the core DNA of a particular field, then it's important to us. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our research side and our approach, and then security research, because I want to make a point about the role of R&D and the role of research on security. Why are we investing so heavily? Because it's hard to predict the future. We had our 30th anniversary as a company a couple of years ago, right after I joined. And Bill Gates, who's still the chairman of the company, he's not active day to day, he's off running his global foundation, but he made the remark at the 30th anniversary, he said, I want this company to be the leading technology company 30 years from now, and I realize that it's not going to get there by selling SharePoint. So we have to actually make our own advances and realize those advances in products. And of course, the fact that prediction is hard it's wonderfully challenging, and it leads to a lot of excitement among our researchers. We have a kind of academic model, a tenure model, if you will, for our full-time researchers, where we hire great people and we let them work on what they're working on. We take no government funding. All of that money that I was talking about is actually internally directed money. We don't do directed research for government institutions. And we're kind of unique in the large R&D space for people working on government problems. I was meeting all day yesterday in Boston with a research lab from General Dynamics, and of course they do billions of dollars in R&D, but it's almost all government money, government directed to government requirements. They were marveling at our ability to kind of set our own course. And just to underline that we actually do, this will reinforce a point later about security. We have very strong connections with academia. We've become, over the last 5 years, one of the major publishers in a variety of different fields of refereed journal articles, and very active in IEEE and a lot of different ACM activities. And one of my best friends in Microsoft Research is just coming off of a 2-year stint as the president of the AAAI, the Artificial Intelligence Association. So very active in joint collaborative work with universities. The environment, the playground for our researchers is also really interesting. So internally, we're a big company. We have about 90,000 full-time employees, a bunch of contractors as well. So we have a really rich and robust internal environment for people to work on security issues. But even more interesting, a lot of people don't realize the footprint of Microsoft in cloud activity. So we were very early in cloud services. Hotmail. We acquired a little startup called Hotmail, I don't know, like 18 years ago now, something like that. And with that and some of the other online properties we have, we're the largest cloud-based email provider, so about twice the size of Gmail. Does anybody here use Gmail? Nobody is willing to admit it. I see that. I see that finger there. Well, we're twice their size. And largest instant messaging platform with Messenger. It's branded in different ways around the world, hundreds of millions of users. And I want to make a point about the scale of this, because we actually wind up using this for a lot of research and real-time or near real-time testing. So it's a very interesting platform on which people can do research. And we've begun in the last few years doing a lot of cloud research engagements, many through NSF and NSF funded and directed projects, collaboratively with academia. It's very interesting for us because in many ways some of the challenges in cloud security are things that we encountered early on. We've come up with our own internal ways to address. They may not be the best and certainly not the only ways to address them, but it's actually a learning experience for us to work with people as, yes.
I don't know if you picked that one in particular, but Dan Reed is one of our distinguished alumni
I was going to
out of the
mention
CS
that.
program.
And
So.
we're losing Dan, by the way, beginning of October. He wanted to go back to academia, can you believe it? But a great guy who's been with us for about the same amount of time as me, about 5 years. And of course, doing these kinds of collaborative cloud and cloud security research efforts, it means that we get our fingers into a lot of pies. We actually are able to look at a lot of different areas and understand a lot about multiple areas in the security issues that are relevant there. So it's led to, it's kind of like the Jeff Bezos moment of, well, I'm selling a lot of books online. I need a lot of compute power and storage to be able to do that, but I'm not using it 24/7. Oh, I'll sell the excess, which became AWS and everything else related with it. We've had a moment like that because of our research platform and environment. So we now actually are getting into it's certainly not a big cash cow or anything, but very interesting set of capabilities that we provide for research as a service. You've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, research as a service, which you might want to check out. It's getting a lot of traction in academic circles. So security in this R&D setting. We started many years ago in Microsoft Research, MSR we call it, in MSR doing different projects. And I wanted to highlight one that began, I think, 3 years ago, called Stratus. And it was, at the time, a somewhat novel approach to how to use cloud resources to optimize cellular data communication and passage. You get a lot of different efficiencies out of it. I point out there the message aggregation, the opportunistic packet scheduling, because you can dynamically allocate resources. So that actually led to the flowering of a lot of different research efforts in the last few years. And I think in February you had a Microsoft research guy here who spoke about several of these projects, not all of them, and laid them out in detail. And I know his videos on the same series. This is fascinating work. It's really interesting. We've been hiring much more. It's part of the increase in our research budget is investment in cloud and all of the related issues around cloud, particularly security. So we've really been doing more and more work on the research side of information security and assurance and trustworthy computing. So is there a problem with that? Well, there might be a little problem with that. The impatient among us, the government. So my main office is in Washington, D.C., not in Redmond. I go out to Redmond pretty frequently, but in Washington, in policy circles, as the two professors here know, and as many of you might know, I hear this phrase all the time. I hear it way too often. We need a Manhattan Project scale project for cybersecurity. That's what we need, a Manhattan Project for cybersecurity. If you use your search engine of choice and you search for that phrase, Manhattan Project and cybersecurity, it's quite common. Even Secretary Chertoff, when he was at DHS, he was prominently bandying this around. A lot of people do it, especially the so-called Beltway bandits, the defense contractors who see the declining amounts of money going into hard weaponry and all the associated tasks for that with the wind down of the wars in the Middle East. And they see the ramp up of money going into cybersecurity. So you actually do hear this kind of phrase and this mentality of we really need to vastly scale up government research, R&D in cybersecurity. So I think that this has not been adequately thought through. So I would question the premise. Let's think about the original Manhattan Project. Because that phrase, that meme, as a Washington meme, is, I think, is seductive and misleading. The hallmarks of the original, the Manhattan Project, in the mid-1940s during World War II to develop the first atomic bomb. Number one, project secrecy, total secrecy. Secrecy like we don't know today. So in today's Washington, where government activities, government projects related with cybersecurity and not, they don't really have the multi-year track record of remaining secret and classified. The kind of absolute secrecy that was enforced in this one led to many people going to jail, led to several deaths, led to the uncovering of Soviet spies involved in the project. But it was certainly, in the moment, it was very, very well protected, secret, classified work. What's another hallmark of the original? Hand-picked participants, the best in the world. Hand-picked, plucked from places like this, and removed to a plateau mountaintop in Los Alamos, behind a secret fence, and told to work there. So the ability of a government research project to actually handpick the very, very best from a global, remember, today's world, as opposed to the 1940s, a global set of participants in ongoing cybersecurity research, I say that's quite a challenge as well. No collaboration with outside groups. It reinforced the security and the secrecy. It had some challenges, but it actually also focused the work in a really important and beneficial way. That would be difficult to pull off today. One single goal. Do we have that in cybersecurity research? I would say no. I see a lot of heads shaking. No. One single goal, not argued about, where everyone knew what the end focus was and what would happen with the result of the research. Everyone knew on the project, and there was no disagreement. Last bullet, maybe the most important. Essentially, unlimited government funding. So could we replicate any of these 5 bullet points today? If not, and if, I assert, these were the conditions, the necessary and obviously demonstrably sufficient conditions for success of the Los Alamos project. If we can't replicate them, then why do we talk about let's do a Manhattan Project for cybersecurity? I think it's as I said, a seductive and misleading way of thinking. I think a better approach, okay, Manhattan scale collaborative research. Globally, the best and brightest minds, but stripping away all of the other stuff, the secrecy, open sharing of research goals, project designs, results, viral spread of research work. In other words, the way that all research is done today, essentially, all valuable research. I look down upon a lot of research that attempts to replicate the secrecy that goes on, that went on in the Manhattan Project anyway. Speaking for ourselves, Microsoft Research, our philosophy absolutely supports this much more open and collaborative approach. We collaborate really deeply. We had started these things, the Blue Hat Security Forums, and if anybody either went to or read about the Black Hat conference this year, we announced a new Blue Hat Prize, $200,000, and it was entirely focused on defensive cybersecurity, trying to incentivize that work. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We have basically an open skies approach on, it's led to things like publishing and really promulgating and evangelizing our SDL, security design lifecycle. So this is a different way of thinking from that kind of Manhattan Project meme that you hear a lot. So I would argue, hey, this already exists. It's just out in the open. It's not under government control. And there is a place, a beneficial and welcome place and role for government in advocating, sometimes guiding, directing, certainly funding appropriate research. But there are two important questions that I think have not yet been resolved, two sets of related questions around that role. And they have to do with money, and they have to do with research agendas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those two questions here, so in the bulk of my remarks. Money for R&D. I talked about the vast amount of multi-billion-dollar research that Microsoft does. We're in the top 10 global corporate research organizations. We're the largest outside the energy field, meaning a couple of car companies and also oil and gas. They spend vast, billions of dollars on research each year. However, overall, private sector funding is challenged, particularly at the early end of a new technology, and certainly cybersecurity, cloud security issues. These are new technologies with new technical challenges that are just being invented. So heavily reliant on venture capital investment. The venture capital numbers don't look good right now and haven't looked good for several years. This chart is showing basically the internet era. So you got the dot-com bubble and its burst there on the left-hand side. You have the build-up to the recession and then the drop-off again with this latest recession. Venture capital investments, these are the total funds raised. To put it in context, this goes back to '85, so a year after the Mac was introduced and when the IBM PC was new. So this is venture capital funding. It really puts in perspective the dot-com bubble and the VC degree of activity and venture investment in new startups. We're not going to see those days again. We're having trouble getting even back to half of what we were before the recession. So I think that's a challenge. Now that's important because in the total pie of R&D funding, U.S. and global, the private sector provides more than 3/4. This is a chart that shows that trend from 1953 until just recently. And what you see with the dotted line at the top is business or corporate or private sector investment in R&D. And the U.S. federal government is the orange dotted line there, slightly below academic funding for R&D. So seeing that trend, that challenge in private sector funding, VC funding, private sector funding, because of understandable global pressures and global economic challenges and the nature of the economy today, and also what many see as a very tough way to ROI, to return on investment in new untested areas of technology. That's a real challenge. So federal money, while it's a small piece of the pie, it's been relatively stable. Not dropping, but certainly not rising. This chart shows federal R&D spending back to during the entire post-World War II era, so back to the beginning of the Cold War, as a percentage of GDP, which is probably the best way to measure it. And you can see just a dramatic decline after the heyday of things coming together, like the Vietnam War, like the space race, and the military competition with the Soviet Union. It's stayed relatively stable there. This also points out the distinction between defense and non-defense R&D. But just one example, the crown jewel of federal investment in R&D, DARPA. DARPA's budget on the eve of 9/11, right before 9/11, while we were still enjoying the peace dividend, DARPA's budget was $3 billion in 2001, $3 billion. With 9/11, they got a slight bump up, $3.1 billion was their 2002 budget. It's stayed right there ever since. So with all the challenges, everything else that defense advanced research should be addressing, we've not increased by a dime. And DoD funding really spiked. So now, with its budget still right there hovering around $3 billion, DARPA is being faced with the prospect of being cut proportionally as the rest of DoD is cut. So they may be cut even, just dramatically more. So it's been a very challenging era for federal R&D. And I think, if you look back in history, there's nobody here from Pennsylvania, I'm assuming. I'm going to slander, with his own words, a former U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. Anybody read the book about the Lincoln election and first administration called Team of Rivals? Doris Kearns Goodwin, some nods. She talked about this guy, Simon Cameron. So 150 years ago, we're on the brink of war, on the brink of the Civil War. We had no standing army. We had never had a standing army. And Fort Sumter, the South begins to secede. Lincoln's about to come into office. Didn't get inaugurated till March in those days, March 1861. In the Senate, they started having an argument over where are we going to find the money to create an army. We also had no income tax, by the way. So there wasn't much money in the federal treasury to invest in a new standing army. And so this guy said, well, just 4 years ago, we started something called the Smithsonian Institution. It was at the time the only science or research effort that the federal government was doing, the only one. He said, I'm tired of all this thing called science. We have spent millions in that sort of thing for the last few years, and it's time it should be stopped. I just love that quote. I love it because it's indicative of a lot of the mindset inside Washington, where funding for science, for research especially, is hostage to other factors, like unpredictable wars, and to a kind of mindset that doesn't necessarily, I respect the hot breath of the people and their representatives, but they're not sent to Washington typically to protect and advance science. I think we can agree on that. Just to show you, by the way, that Washington never changes. What happened to Simon Cameron? Ironically, later that year, Lincoln comes into office and he appoints Simon Cameron to be essentially the head of all federal science, which then was military. He became Secretary of War. Then he got tossed out because he was corrupt as heck. And sure enough, just to show that Washington never really changes, he later got reelected to the U.S. Senate again. So just a perfect story arc to represent Washington's relationship with science. When you have this kind of questionable relationship with a stable commitment to funding science and research, I think that necessarily creates and engenders risk. And the question of predominance, who's going to predominate over the questions of what kinds of research will we be doing? Usually the money is the big dog that gets to bark, so who's funding the research gets to steer it to a certain degree. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and particularly in one vector, and that's the question of offensive research, research for offensive uses of cybersecurity advances, and defensive cybersecurity. But from a research perspective, DARPA, whom I mentioned, DARPA very recently, these are articles from this year, has been focusing a lot of effort on offensive research into creating cyber weapons. We're deciding where the next creation of a word beginning with cyber is going to be. It gets attached as an adverb or adjective to everything. So this summer, they have publicly announced and done a call for, they've done an RFI, request for information, and they're holding some public sessions in the next couple of weeks for something they call Plan X. Plan X. It sounds like a 50s science fiction movie. Very smart people in DARPA who are working on something that their commanders have told them in DOD is absolutely critical to the nation's security and to the nation's ability to protect critical infrastructures. So this is what Plan X, which has a classified amount of millions of dollars attached to it, this is what Plan X is going to be focusing on. So this is offensive research. At Microsoft, so we're just, a company on the outside. We spend a lot of money and invest a lot of effort in cybersecurity and cybersecurity research, securing our products. We're a product company. We sell software. We want that to be the most secure product that people can buy. So we invest a lot of money and time and effort and research into creating security around our current products and for all the fancy things that we're going to be inventing over the next few years, securing them. And we do most of that under the rubric of trustworthy computing. That is a mindset for us now, trustworthy computing. So it's a little difficult for us to think about the degree of effort going on in government-driven research towards offensive research to develop offensive capabilities. There's always the argument about, well, some of these things are dual use. I'm not so sure that's true, and I've thought about this a little bit. I see some parallels in previous technologies, and I haven't really done any deep thinking on this, but as is probably obvious. But I wanted to point out a little bit about some of these similar cleavages that developed through recent history. One is on a really kind of mundane but important in law enforcement question, and it's a question really for armaments manufacturers, who in many ways often are the same as the people who manufacture protective devices, Kevlar, bullet-resistant vests, and so forth. There's a kind of hand-in-glove relationship in that industry, in those industries. Well, it's a problem for them because they wind up, we can create a better bullet-resistant vest, but then we can also, in the very same lab, in the very same testing, we're creating much better capabilities to pierce that same armor. We know all the technical specs of what would conceivably defeat the Kevlar, so we can manufacture the defeating ammunition. So it's really, I've made a little Microsoft joke there. This kind of leads to the thinking of a new meaning to Patch Tuesday. But thank God for Gene laughing at that. Not familiar with that phrase. Yeah. But that's a real head scratcher for him. And you wind up seeing the exact same dilemma now in this army, this legion of cybersecurity defense contractors, many of them small startups, VC companies, who for the last several years have, by and large, been focusing on how can we do better cybersecurity. The nation's critical infrastructure needs protection. DoD networks need protection. Consumer users of the web need protection. So there's been a lot of research on that. And now there's the possibility, maybe the probability, that a lot of government money is going to be invested in research and development of offensive cyber capabilities. So I have many friends in the industry who are thinking, well, which should we be doing? Is it the same? It's not really the same. Another area in history, recent history, where you had that same dilemma and dynamic, and if you look at the history of what happened with stealth technologies, this would be worthy of a great talk all by itself. I'm not going to have a personal interest in this because my older brother was a stealth fighter pilot, the F-117. The history of the technologies that went together into making that particular plane, and then the B-2 as a bomber, the stealth bomber, and then the incorporation of stealth technologies into other aircraft, the F-22, the F-35. No dual-use purpose there. We're not making stealthy civilian aircraft. There's no need. Quite the opposite. So there's no other use for stealth technologies aside from military. And it's an offensive capability. There's nothing defensive. It sounds defensive if you think only about the plane. Well, we're trying to defeat the radar and other sensing mechanisms. It's actually designed to do that only because you're sending these planes into hostile territory. So it's an offensive capability designed to protect offensive strikes. And of course, from an R&D perspective, there was an enormous burst of funding and interest and activity in research into counter-stealth technologies. And so this is on the DARPA website right now. You might have seen some activity just in the last month around hypersonics, both in aircraft and in undersea craft. The effort to make them stealthy is of high interest in the defense world, not just ours, other nations as well. That's offensive capabilities, which engender other research into defensive methods, but again, only usable by military establishments. A lot of money, only for that sole use, no dual use. And of course, as you see, this kind of cycle develops, even as they explain it. Today, that strategic advantage is threatened as other nations' abilities in stealth and counter-stealth improve, so we have to restore. It's an arms race. An arms race in this particular R&D set of activities to try and provide the dominance once afforded by stealth to support a range of wanted future national security missions. And my third example, also it's been studied, no pun intended, to death over the last 40, 50 years, is nuclear strategic doctrine. Guys like Herman Kahn and Henry Kissinger and others in the Cold War. It drove a lot of really interesting areas of research in game theory and game theoretic modeling and so forth, but it really had at its core this premise of mutual assured destruction. If you recall, you guys are all young, you don't remember it like we do, but you had essentially two nuclear powers, and only two nuclear powers. Let's leave aside when the Chinese came along. The UK and the French kept a couple of things they could lob at each other, supposedly. U.S. and Soviet Union massively adding to their stockpile of weapons. The United States never once publicly said, we will not use nuclear weapons first. We never said that. There was a kind of mythology that we felt that, but our planners, our presidents, never made that kind of a pledge because we had a conventional asymmetry. The Russians had many more men under arms. They had a very aggressive Cold War stance in Europe, in Asia. Not to get into the history of Third World strategic back and forth, but hotspots like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and even the Middle East were all touched by this rivalry, which at its pinnacle was expressed in how we designed and deployed our nuclear strategic forces. Each of us spent essentially 40 years with massive arrays of strategic weapons, strategic meaning they were designed to not be used in a war like Vietnam or Afghanistan, but U.S. striking the Soviets striking the U.S. homeland. This notion of mutual assured destruction is fascinating if you want to look into it. It has it at its core, and it was the acronym MAD because it's kind of crazy thinking. If we have enough weapons to survive their first strike, so if they can't get all our weapons in a first strike, if they can't be assured of it, then we could have enough weapons survive to launch back at them in a second strike, and we could destroy them. You don't need all that many weapons to do a functional destruction of a civilization. We had thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. The numbers come down some now because of strategic reduction talks. But we had many thousands. We had north of 10,000 warheads and the delivery vehicles for them. The delivery vehicles for them, to ensure the second strike survivability, we went to a triad. So the nuclear triad, you hear that phrase, was airborne, B-52s and B-2s that could carry and drop nuclear weapons, land-based ICBM missiles, which were out here in the heartland mostly, at bases in Alaska and here in the continental U.S. Strategic missiles that, again, we never said we wouldn't do a first strike, so they could be used in a first strike, but they were really designed to, they were hard targets. They were deeply buried, almost impenetrable. You'd need a really direct strike by a very powerful nuclear missile on the Soviet side to destroy that weapon. If it can survive, it can be launched. And then the third leg, underwater, nuclear submarines. We had a couple of dozen nuclear, strategic nuclear submarines. So we had this triad designed to defend, but it was really designed to attack. So the kind of mental gymnastics in the research world, because there were many people who were actually in the United States and in other countries who were conflicted by that cleavage, that dilemma between working on things in the national interest, one in the room, very common in academia, people who were essentially critical to the national interest, who in a Manhattan Project scale effort would have been drafted and put in Los Alamos, who didn't like the idea that, well, now we know more about this process. Now we know what these things would be for. And the United States never pledged not to use these weapons first. I think, by the way, that was a smart move, and it worked out, post hoc. But on this last bullet here, so it incentivizes offensive activity, offensive advances in research, offensive targeting practices and doctrine. And when you incentivize that, you're incentivizing it for the industrial base that's required to design and build this. And so it became, a difficult dance with the devil, if you will, for companies and individuals to actually work on projects like this. And there were many companies who were doing technologies that might have been dual use in the targeting and guidance and advanced telemetry and computer-related issues, who kind of defected from doing that kind of work. They didn't want to. Because of that unresolved line around defense and offense. So, a typical cop-out in the talk is, well, so this requires future thought. And it certainly does. Many questions remain for companies that are working in the R&D space for things that could be used for national defense in the cyber realm. I'll observe that for a company like Microsoft, it's important because we're a global company. We're globally located. We sell globally. We sell to every country on earth. And in doing that, we focus on, again, trustworthy products. We want governments and citizens of every country in the world to trust our products and not to assume that, well, we're doing something offensive. So we only do defensive research, services, products, trying to secure our products and the products of others. So that's a great place to be, but there's also the kind of sword of Damocles hanging over you if you are creating products that you can argue, as we credibly can, these are defensive. They're designed to defend computer systems and networks. Let's just hypothetically say that a U.S. policymaker said to a company that did that, well, but if you're selling it to Russia and to China, the governments thereof, well, you're helping their defense establishment. We have export restrictions for capabilities like that. So this is a very difficult, thorny legal and policy issue. The world isn't stopping. It's commonplace to talk about Moore's law. I think even more important is a sort of corollary, which is that when you get the, if you will, the network effect of different things taking advantage of Moore's law and laws like it, you get an even bigger bang for the buck, an even bigger exponential advance in capability. So the guy at Intel who runs all of their data center work, their data center business for Intel products, points out the largest supercomputers are getting much larger, much more capable, 2 times the speed of Moore's law. I mean, now that's fascinating. And I think as services, web services, research driven services embed themselves even more and entwine themselves together, the exponential gathering of force there is going to push technology even faster. My boss, Craig Mundy, Chief Research and Strategy Officer, let me go back to that, he points out that this confluence of multiple things, quantum computing, things like it, over the next few years are certainly going to drive us to a spot where we can't predict it now, but it's going to be revolutionary. One last point, and this is certainly in the kind of editorial category. So I did work for the government, and I worked for a DoD agency. And you know, the important thing about DoD is it's a big bureaucracy, right? It's the biggest of the big bureaucracies, and it operates like a bureaucracy. And so, you know, they're a big computer customer, software, hardware, and they try to take advantage of all these advances in the industry. I postulate something called Whatley's Law. I wanted to come up with my own law. And I was working in the Pentagon at the time, so of course it had to be an acronym. And I'll tell you what it stands for after explaining it. It was my observation that the lag time of the government in going along with a commercial advance, something in the private sector, the internet. Yes, they were DoD-funded people who were helping invent it, but no one can argue that the government was an early adopter of internet capabilities, because it's not true. And certainly in cybersecurity practices, most private sector areas are vastly quicker adopters. So the lag time that the government has, for a lot of different reasons, terrible acquisition policies and practices among them, and just kind of general disincentive towards acting fast and nimbly and agilely in government, the lag time actually doubles. It gets slower. It's like molasses. The only saving grace is you have all these other acceleration factors going into the equation, so it actually pulls them up just about level at a lag time, I'd say about 2 years behind the rest of us. That's where big government bureaucracies typically are. And it's true in the cybersecurity realm. So my postulated law is Whatley's Law, wave as the train leaves your station, because that's the feeling for a lot of government offices. I don't have time to talk about the longest term bet in the work that we're doing and some other people are doing. We're highly competitive in this space, quantum computing, and others can talk about it far better than me. But if you're interested, there's a URL for our work in that arena. It promises to be, if you think about today, we now live in the silicon economy. One could conceivably argue that within a decade or two, we'll be living in a quantum economy with all the same perturbations and advances in the rest of society and the economy that have happened because of the silicon revolution. So it's a fascinating field, and we're working on it pretty heavily. There's my email address if anybody has any thoughts on this. There's our research website, which is chock full of papers on current research in security that we're doing. Just enormously valuable resource, I think. A lot of published white papers and current research. And I wanted to point out that one guy on my team who has a lot of government experience has been writing several white papers over the last year on this defensive, offensive question, Dave Oxman. And those are at cyberbelli.com. So those are my prepared remarks. If we have any time, I'd love to entertain any snide questions or... Yes, sir.
I don't have a microphone, but
I'll repeat your question.
It's obvious that the government is lagging. For R&D, do you prefer the government to be lagging, or do you prefer them to be ahead of you?
That's a great question. The question was, it's obvious that the government is lagging. Do I prefer the government to be lagging or prefer them to be ahead of me? Let me first stipulate I'm an American citizen. I love the American government. I went to Thomas Jefferson's University, University of Virginia undergrad. so I have a complicated feeling about the government. But it's great. So I'm patriotic. I want our government to do well. I'm a taxpayer. I want my money to be spent wisely and well and efficiently. I know it's not. So there's that. My first experience in the government was as a grad student. I was at Stanford. I had a young woman, professor, never heard of her since then, Condi Rice. Wonder what happened to her. She made well. And she arranged for me to go back to the Pentagon. I was doing Soviet studies. So 1985 and 86, I worked for a little while in the Pentagon. I was a Soviet Kremlinologist. I was looking at Soviet political and military leaders and trying to predict what they were doing. We were doing a research project on the U.S.-Soviet long-term competition. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed just a couple of years later. So it wasn't all that great of a long-term research project. When I got there, I assumed that, wow, this is going to be great. I was coming. It's 1985. We're not talking about the dark ages. Stanford University had Macintoshes everywhere. I had my own IBM PC XT, which had it was the first one with a hard disk. I had a 20 megabyte hard disk. Wow, it was incredible. I went there thinking, I'm going to have a supercomputer on my desk. This is going to be phenomenal. No, I was issued an IBM Selectric typewriter, a Selectric 2, the one with the little typing ball. It had the erasing ball. That was the technological advance that the government was providing its information workers. That's what I was. I mean, it was a dusty summer with books, hard copy. So I don't want government to be behind. And certainly I recognize the reality of the cybersecurity field and the challenges that we face from state actors, non-state actors, and the hazy gray areas in between. So I certainly want government to be au courant with both the practices and the research going on in the field of cybersecurity. But it's inescapable that distortions creep into a field of government-led research endeavor if the cleavage between offensive and defensive hasn't been fully explored. And that's why I point that out in a couple of these kind of obscure things like the armor-piercing ammunition case, where it's driving, this may sound tiny comparatively, but it's a big legislative dilemma in a lot of cities and states around the country over what you do and don't want to allow access to. Yes, sir.
It's a short footnote to your answer. Unfortunately, I had to miss most of your...
You missed the good part. All the jokes. These guys were rolling. It was,
right,
yeah.
right. But I have something you don't have. You Soviet criminologist, and I have the Soviet accent. So anyway,
I defer.
I just wanted to say that your statement, I'm a U.S. citizen, I love my government, are a conjunction, not an implication. As a naturalized U.S. citizen, I can testify that the only obligation I took was not to disrupt the U.S. government in 1984, and I have been restraining myself ever since. You,
Keep
sir,
that up.
you, sir, as a native-born U.S. citizen,
Yes.
don't have such an obligation.
Yeah.
You can disrupt it anytime you wish.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, Thomas Jefferson, my personal hero, said the tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of revolution periodically. So that's an extreme statement by the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, you said you'd welcome snarky, or I don't know if that was the exact word, but comments along those lines.
Yes.
And I just thought I'd point out, there is a reason why it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. As for Station Q, you told us where it is and how to observe it, so we have no idea how fast it's going to go.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Which, by the way, is an active principle, as you probably know, in the field of quantum research, leading to some very obscure but absolutely critical and fundamental dilemmas in that research. So, absolutely. Good point. Yeah. Meow.
Is there anybody else? And if you don't know about Schrodinger's equations or his cat, you can look that up. Go to Bing, and you can find it.
Bing, Bing. By the way, Bing. I mean, save yourself the trouble. The plucky startup search engine. It's only 4 letters. Why waste all that extra time? It's only 1 syllable. You know, just Bing, Bing. It's so easy. People love it. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right, yes, sir.